We come from the Action 52 game world where every game is...
Yeah, we're talking action and lots of it. We got space, dragon, adventure, even war games.
Yeah, dude, we even got rescue games, and man, they're smooth like ice.
Hey, what about you guys?
Oh yeah, we're in there too. The Cheetah Man.
Yes, but that's another story. If you want the ultimate game challenge, you have to get Action 52.
Yeah, it's so cool. 52 games in one, and you can even play it on Nintendo. Man, it's awesome. Get yours now.
Now playing at a store near you.
A lot of people consider Action 52 to be one of the worst NES games of all time, but did you know it had a Genesis version as well? Not that it was a whole lot better, but the name of the developer attached might surprise you. Farsight Studios, the same studio that developed the Pinball Arcade decades later. I guess that suited them better. More so than Art Alive, anyway. Either way, the multi-game cart wasn't a far stretch from the typical bootleg offering. In fact, that's what inspired Vince Perry to put Action 52 together with the help of Mario Gonzalez and Javier Perez, though he gave them almost no time to develop the games. All he cared about was making a multimedia franchise out of the infamous Cheetah Men, the game that has come to define the compilation. But when the game was released and critically bombed thanks to the game's relative incomplete and broken coding, Action 52 became the ultimate Icarus story, if Icarus made his wings out of random scrap metal and cardboard. Obviously, it was not a good idea to try to cram 52 full-length games into one cartridge, let alone charging $200 for it. But what if it was a good idea? What if, given enough time and money, and placed in the hands of the right developers, there was a mythical package that actually contained 50 high-quality games? And I'm not talking about WarioWare, not 5-second microgames, but the real deal. That's the pitch for UFO 50, a massive collection of bespoke indie games by a supergroup of 6 developers who have worked on Spelunky, Ridiculous Fishing, Catacomb Kids, Downwell, and Poinpy. There's platformers, shoot-em-ups, beat-em-ups, RPGs, and even sports get some representation. The fiction around the compilation involves a fake video game company that operated over an 8-year period, with the games increasing in complexity and visual depth as the years go on. While the game was originally meant to come out in 2018, I'm kind of glad it didn't, because that extra time went into really polishing and fleshing out these games and creating a sort of meta-narrative universe in which games become series, characters become mascots, and a company ebbs and flows with the various shifts in the gaming industry. Now, by the time this video comes out, you'll already know whether it was a massive success or not, and of course I'd love if it was, that'd be great for them. But even if it isn't, that was never gonna stop me from making this video, because as soon as I saw the 50 games start to take fruition in recent trailers, I knew I wanted to play and rank all of them. I've beaten over 120 games this year already, so what's another 50 for the pile? Now, okay, I know some are multiplayer and some are score chasers, so I can't literally beat all of them, but that's quitter talk and I love a challenge. And also, you can beat all of them. There are win states for all 50 games, and every game has a single player mode. The real reason I didn't beat every game for this video is because it'd probably take me over 150 hours to do that, and I don't want this project to come out in 2025. I'm definitely gonna beat them all, but that is a journey that extends beyond the release of this video. So I'll beat as many as I can, but within the realm of sanity and reason. Well, my definition of sanity and reason, don't mistake it for your own. Let's begin. Now, there's the developmental history of UFO 50 and the developmental history of UFO Soft, the fictional company within the game. This developer, formerly known as LX Systems, built a console computer called the LX1 and had an 8-year run in the industry. Starting as just a regular computer business making applications, one day they caught one of their employees making a game that would completely change their trajectory as a studio. There's more story to get into than just that, but it sets the scene and makes you sort of an amateur historian, piecing together the story of this company as they rose to fame. When you start the game, you're treated to a cute demo scene-esque intro that credits Mossmouth as the people who discovered an old LX computer in a garage, and worked to get the games off of the computer and running again. Then there's a cute little Mario 3 style intro that leads to the title screen, followed by the massive truckload of games to select from, all dusty and cobwebbed until you brush them off and boot them up. In addition to sorting the games chronologically, alphabetically, or by general feel, there's also what I like to call a little guy house in the garden, and completing objectives in the various games will add little furnishings to the little guy house. Now, this doesn't accomplish anything, but it's the kinda cute and pointless addition I can really appreciate when they didn't have to do it. But getting back to the games, it might be hard to figure out where to start, which is why the developers helpfully included an attract mode that kicks off if you wait at the menu for long enough, and shows off random games. But I'm not gonna need that because, like the title suggests, I'm playing all of these motherfuckers. So let's try to sort this into some sort of coherent list and do a genre by genre breakdown, starting with... Barboozza is the earliest game in the UFO Soft catalog, and it definitely shows its age, with its minimal sound design, lack of music, and room-by-room design that almost gives it more of an MS-DOS or MSX feel than a TV console. But skip over this one at your own peril, because it has some pretty hidden depth to it. Right off the bat, you can tell some of its inspiration just by walking to the right and stepping on a trap, which immediately kills you. What is this, Kingsfield? Okay, obviously La Mulana or Maze of Gallius have a more clear direct connection here, although I'm also reminded of modern games like Elephantasy. While your guy is slow, has a tiny knife, and dies in one hit, that doesn't mean the game is primitive. In fact, it's got Metroidvania design aspects as well as shopkeepers and secrets. I'm still working to complete this one, but already I've gotten items like an amulet, umbrella, candy, and figuring out what they do is up to the player. But I know I can climb ladders faster now, which means there's a spot that I can go back to and finally get past. That being said, I do wish there was some kind of music to go along with the game. Even just something ambient and atmospheric would have been nice, but instead, it seems like Mossmouth outside of the fiction expects most players to have a podcast on or their own music. And you only have 6 retries, represented as eggs that you burst out of, so you will absolutely not complete this on the first try. With no save support, that does mean you'll get a half hour in and then die for the 7th time and lose all your progress, which can be demoralizing. It may be best to play this game much like you would a time loop game like Homebody or Deathloop, where you slowly figure out the correct order of progression and routing, and then work towards getting the perfect run. Barboozza gets a C+, but I may upgrade that to a B if the game continues to surprise me. Ninpeck is easily the shortest platformer on this list, an auto-scroller about rescuing your beloved cheeseburger after it gets stolen. Finally, a game for asexuals. Well, I didn't quite feel this one until I realized I had a double jump. That put everything into place, because there's a lot of enemies and projectiles you'll have to maneuver around, and even with your trusty shurikens, you won't be able to clear every enemy. Well, maybe a god gamer can, I can't. Defeating enemies will either give you a score balloon of various colors and point values to pick up, or a bonus shuriken, and you could throw up to 3 at a time. After reaching certain score milestones, a 1-up balloon will float up from the bottom of the screen and you can pop it for an extra life. The game ends with a confrontation with an octopus, which wasn't too hard to take down, and after a congratulations screen, you're sent back to the beginning with some free 1-up balloons and a slightly harder journey with most enemies upgraded and new enemies to deal with. Much like an actual cheeseburger, I wouldn't expect this to stay in your memory for too long after playing it, but it's decently fun and doesn't overstay its welcome. I'll give this one a B-. Wow, this one is brilliant. How are there not more games designed like this in the world? The closest analog that I can come up with for Mortal is the indie classic The Swapper, but this is more of a fast platformer than a puzzle game, and the true strategy is in the optimization rather than just throwing a bunch of bodies at the solution. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The story of Mortal is gloriously dystopian, as the government calls loyal soldiers to lay down their lives for the kingdom, and this is quite literal, as they are taught 3 rituals, all of them fatal: turning into stone, exploding in a huge radius, or hurling themselves forward like an arrow. You're given 20 soldiers, or lives, to get through 8 challenging levels, and this will require sacrificing each guy to allow the next one to progress further. Sometimes you'll need to plant yourself in the wall to provide a platform, sometimes you'll need to turn to stone to provide a safe haven from spikes, and sometimes you'll have to blow up to get rid of obstacles. Along the way, there are pickups that replenish your lives, and if you happen to kill enough enemies, you'll also get the occasional 1-up. By the time you reach the end of the level, you'll likely have depleted a lot of your total lives, though you will get a free 10 spot at every exit. But here's the additional fun of the game, because Mortal allows you to go back and replay previous stages, and it always reminds you of how many lives you ended up with. Along with a helpful autosave, this means going back and optimizing your route so that you have more lives on hand for the later stages. And of course, you may learn a new technique later on that you'll want to go back and utilize earlier. For example, I didn't realize until later that you can use the arrow technique and then use the bomb technique on the same person, which could help save some time clearing a path to the wall. Mortal is gonna run you a couple of hours just from the optimization alone, making it the best of UFO Soft's early catalog. I give it an A-. Valgress is a vertical tower climb with a very Samus-esque protagonist and Metroid-y music, where the goal is to climb higher and higher without touching the death trap at the bottom that follows you. But you can't sit and think about where to jump, because all of the platforms you rest on are crumbling beneath you, so you have no choice but to keep moving and thinking on your feet. The game is both addictive and frustrating because you'll die at the most inopportune time and have to start over, but a single button press starts the game right back up, and you'll likely go, one more time. The platform placement is randomly determined as you climb, and each level has 30 floors to climb before you reach a shop, where you can use the coins you find to purchase roguelite-ish upgrades like a coin magnet or a more powerful gun. There are also star blocks that allow you to rocket up several floors in an instant, and special enemies that drop keys, as well as hazard blocks that can explode. You don't have hit points in the game, you're merely stunned, which is obviously devastating when you're trying to avoid that trap at the bottom, but I would have liked to have had at least one shield point with each level, just so I can enjoy getting to a new floor a tiny bit longer before screwing up and getting sent all the way back to the bottom. That's really a personal gripe though, a skill issue, a get good. I think this is a good game, I just keep slipping or activating my double jump too early, and that's really on me. If I was irrational, I'd give Valgress a C+ for the frustration, but recognizing the strength of the design and addictive vibes, I'll give it a B-. Mooncat may be the weirdest game in the entire collection. Your character is some sort of alien eggplant with legs, the environments are unusual and filled with enemies like rolling eyeballs and jumping skulls, and the movement system is intentionally bizarre. With any D-pad press moving you to the left and any face button moving you to the right, you might think that you're being trolled like a Bennett Foddy game, but try to get over it because the actual gameplay is not quite so rage-inducing. While holding one direction, you can press a button of the opposite direction to jump, and pressing it again will do a ground pound. You can also press the same direction twice to do a sliding dash. It almost feels like a piss take on one-button games, but there is a method to the madness here. Enemy placements are mostly reasonable, and their movements and reactions are easy to understand and prepare for, and you'll need to utilize their locations to progress further by bouncing off of them. The real challenge, though, waits beyond the boss. As it turns out, you've only gotten the first ending! See, in the lore, Mooncat is a spiritual sequel to Barbuta, which means that there's secrets aplenty in this game, and you'll have to master the moveset and experiment with bounces to reach new locations. I wouldn't say that Mooncat is my favorite game, and it may be a bit too offbeat to really feel like a genuine retro game, but I'm glad it's in the collection. I'll give it a B-. Now, if you actually want a Bennett Foddy type experience, then look to Waldorf's Journey, an anger generator about hurling a walrus through the air, with all the grace that a walrus flying through the air would achieve. You aim and then charge up a power meter, kinda like Team 17's Worms. Your chonky flippers can be used to provide a bit of flight and resistance, but if the wind is blowing too strongly, that won't help you too much, and you'll need to keep replenishing it with fish. Your lives in the game are represented as puffins that rescue you from a fatal fall, and you'll have to find them throughout the level to get them to help you. There are also signs with odd writing, and a shop where you can purchase consumable items that can give you a slight advantage, like a balloon for gentler falls, or a propeller that ignores all weather effects, or a beach ball that you can use to test your leaps before you do it yourself. This sort of game is not really my cup of tea, although I did manage to finish it. I do think that the random generation hurts it a little though, because the games it draws inspiration from are handcrafted and, I don't know, it hits different when it's just a bunch of random floating platforms rather than the twisted designs of a sadist. It's also very short, as I finished it within a half hour, and the cherry challenge on this one is just to have more shells by the time you reach the end, so I don't feel particularly inclined to replay it. I give Waldorf's Journey a C-. If you're a devoted viewer of this channel, you're probably wondering when and not if I'm going to slavishly obsess over a Metroidvania. Barboozza could sorta fit into that category, in the same way a lot of 80s adventure platformers of the home computer era could, but if we're talking straight up pure Metroid, then Vanger is that game. You're a security robot awoken from stasis to find that every other robot on Io has gone amok, and it's up to you to figure out why. An interesting quirk of this game is that you can flip gravity at any time, one of 2 games in the collection that do this. You'll need to flip gravity to reach certain platforms to progress, as well as avoiding spikes and other hazards. Another interesting quirk is the mod system. As you find upgrade modules, you actually have a choice of where you can install them, which changes their perk. Install the heat mod to your armor, for example, and you'll be able to enter high temperature areas without taking damage. Or attach the multi-mod to your gun and you can shoot multiple bullets like everyone's favorite weapon from Contra. I'd say the closest comparison to Vanger would probably be Axiom Verge, given the combination of Metroid exploration and run-and-gun shooting and weaponry, but the level design has a bit more thought put into it because of the gravity mechanics. One thing I don't like about the game is that you can only access the map at save terminals, which I guess makes it slightly more advanced than the original Metroid, but I think it's kinda weird that the controllers for the LX computer don't have any kind of start or select button. Sure, start is used by UFO 50 to bring up the general menu, but no select button? I find that kinda odd. I can't think of a single home console that didn't have a start button, unless you get into the weirder controllers like the Intellivision or the original Atari joystick, and they're obviously aiming for the feel of NES games, so why not put the map on the select or back button? This criticism could actually extend out to the rest of the collection as well, because I do feel like important functionality could be tied to that button for several games, and wouldn't cause any kind of break in the narrative fiction that UFO 50 is trying to establish, or any kind of shattering of the nostalgic illusion each individual game is pulling off. But I'm straying a bit too far off topic now. I think that this game is mostly good, but it's a little disappointing that those wall bosses repeat. I know, it's a 50-game collection, but fighting them repeatedly is just a little tedious. It's not a super long game, however, just around 3-ish hours, so it's not a huge minus. You'd probably get a better Metroidvania experience from a proper standalone game, but as the token representation in UFO 50, it's still pretty decent. I'll give Vanger a B-. While the original Mortal was a level-by-level affair, Mortal 2, the Confederacy of Noobs. Okay, I'm just gonna call it Mortal 2, that name is too stupid. The sequel goes wide and deep with one massive stage and many paths to traverse. Unlike the first game, which gave you 20 lives and various opportunities to increase that number, Mortal 2 gives you 100 lives and that's it. Which sounds like a lot, but remember, you're sacrificing your characters. And also, it's not so simple to just get around without dying, as there are a lot of enemies and some of them take multiple sacrificial attacks to defeat. The sequel also introduces classes, like the warrior who can not only turn to stone, but do it in the air as well, or the gunner who has long-range firing and drops ammo boxes on death, or the ninja who can provide a teleporter pad for easy fast travel. Using all of these classes becomes just as crucial as deciding on an overall path, as once again, optimization is the key to making it to the end, and you're likely to reset multiple times. It may even be worth getting out a notepad and mapping the world so that you can— I mean, look, I know I'm showing a digital map right now, but just pretend you're in the 1980s like this game, so that you can decide on an order of events to follow through. Because, yeah, you can turn a warrior to stone on a push platform that activates certain colored blocks, but maybe you don't want to do that too early, or maybe you want to activate a different colored block sooner. I don't know if I'd call Mortal 2 as good as the original, because the first game is so brilliant on its own and the concept of revisiting stages to improve my life count is such a major part of its appeal. But I think that Mortal 2 is still interesting in its own way, and the world design is interesting in how many routes are available and how many paths intersect. This may be the only time in my life I award a Confederacy a B+. Rakshaka is the closest you'll get to a ghost or a goblin in UFO 50, as it shares the Capcom Classic's brutal difficulty, lack of air control, and endlessly spawning enemies to torture you, but it's not completely unfair. As the game's opening shows you, you have the ability to resurrect after death, so long as your ghost can collect every ring without touching an enemy or projectile, and the more you die, the harder this gets, as more and more rings and enemies spawn in this phase. So you're really just gonna have to get good at the game to progress any deeper into it, which I've done. Sorta? I've gotten to the third boss anyway, which is, I imagine, a lot further than the average player is going to get before moving on to another game, but I'm not calling it bad by any stretch. I actually think the resurrection mechanic is pretty fascinating, and the Contra-like weapons definitely help even the odds a little bit against some pretty nefarious enemy placement. The fireball makes short work of bosses, the spread shot can do solid crowd control, and the homing ring can take care of the peskier enemies that are harder to hit. There's also a bell that can spawn on rare occasion, which will lower your death count by 1, and I don't really know how it spawns or whether I have any control over that, but it's obviously a massive help if you can get one. There's also a little demon pal that hatches out of an egg that can shield you from one hit and point out hidden hotspots that trigger bonus gold to appear. Although your score is purely perfunctory and doesn't grant any extra lives or continues, it's solely for leaderboard chasing. If you're looking for a major challenge and somehow UFO 50 hasn't already given it to you yet, you'll find a very tricky opponent here. I give Rakshaka a C. The last platformer on this list is not only the silliest, but it's also the final chronological game in the history of UFO Soft. Cyber Owls is by far the most direct-pointed parody of the original Action 52, as its promised comic book spin-off, Saturday morning cartoon designs, and cheesy action are an obvious riff on not only the Cheetah Men, but the toyetic kid shows of the late 80s and early 90s. The evil organization Hawk has gotten their hands on a nuclear weapon, and it's up to the 4 Cyber Owls and their shrieking regular owl sidekick to save the day. While I list Cyber Owls as a platformer, that's not 100% accurate, because each character's mission plays out as its own genre. One owl is a behind-the-back gallery shooter like Cabal or Wild Guns, another is a vehicular action sequence not unlike Battletoads, the third is a top-down stealth assignment a la Metal Gear, and the fourth is a punch-heavy platformer in the vein of Power Blade. And even that's not all, as a 5th gameplay genre opens up whenever an owl happens to fail on their mission and get captured. Then the game becomes a top-down turn and tile-based roguelite about clearing the enemies and freeing your friend. I'm really bad at that one, I gotta say. I don't know if it's actually even possible to win these, because I failed every single rescue attempt with every hero no matter what I try. So I guess do your best not to fail those main missions. And honestly, it's not likely that you will, because these missions aren't super hard. Though you only have 2 lives per mission, you can get at least 1 extra life if not 2 from regular play, and each hero has a life bar as well. Now I don't love the gameplay in this, I think each of these missions is sort of a pale imitation of their source material. They're not bad, mind you, but they come up short in various ways. The Power Blade tribute could have used some sort of power up, the Cabal tribute is just a bit too on the nose referencing Operation Wolf, the Metal Gear tribute lets you escape enemy alerts just by moving from one room to another, but look, it's hard not to be charmed by the ridiculous presentation and the goofy villains you encounter. How can you not love Road Toad or Psy Cow? For that reason alone, I'm feeling pretty generous, and I'll give Cyber Owls a B-. Zelda randomizers are all the rage in the 2020s, and I get why. It's interesting to go back through a game you loved as a kid with the placement of items completely changed around. It changes up how you progress entirely and makes for a very unique experience. Planet Zoldath is going for that same vibe, with a world that randomizes every time you die. The goal is to find 3 pieces of the intergalactic treasure map, one of which is held by a shopkeeper, one of which is in the overworld, and one of which is in an underground dungeon. Like Zelda, there are weapons and tools to find that increase your understanding and traversal through the world, like a boomerang that can grab things from afar, a nail gun that can pierce ice walls, a translator to talk to the 2 friendly species, and boots for walking across toxic terrain. These items are placed just as randomly as the world, which is a double-edged sword because it does mean the path to progression is different every time, but it also means that a bad seed could place items in unhelpful locations, or you just flat out can't find them. NPCs will trade with you, and sometimes items are held by those vendors, which means some runs will require resource farming, which I've never been a big fan of. I think this one is interesting, but it does a few things that keep it at arm's length for me, personally. I give Planet Zoldath a C. Now, for a better Zelda experience, hop over, or maybe drive over, to Golfaria, an open-world adventure where you control a sentient golf ball, hooking and putting and slicing your way from overworld to underworld to collect various new abilities, as well as destroy evil parbots and rescue friends. You start off in a village of fairly helpful spherical friends, and where you choose to go to at that point is up to you. Much like the original Zelda, there's a lot of the overworld map you can touch from the very beginning, but unlike Zelda, your travel efficiency will really depend on what upgrades you've gotten. You can't simply bulldoze your way through the sandy dunes of the east, for example, until you found an upgrade that lets you smoothly roll and bounce off of them. And also, getting anywhere in the game is going to be a little tricky until you've increased your strokes. Yeah, this is a game on a pitch count, and until you upgrade your maximum swings, you're likely going to flounder a bit until you start honing in on specific regions to focus on. I definitely had no idea what I was doing until I got a few stroke upgrades and then visited the Northwest Temple. After a lot of careful and efficient maneuvering, I got my hands, well, grooves? Divots? On the Blockbuster upgrade, which allows you to break through dirt blocks scattered all over the over- and underworld. This opened things up a bit more, and what surprised me was that this was the second upgrade. There's actually an earlier upgrade I initially missed that allows you to hit the brakes after you've taken a swing. It comes in very handy when trying to scale high cliff sides, and let's just pretend that was a first try, okay? There's also parts of a holy golf tee that you're looking for as well, scattered to the 4 regions. I've found a couple so far, but only gotten one as of this review. I assume they're required for the cherry completion. These reviews are somewhat unstuck in time, so I don't know which came first, but a cherry completion is basically a bonus objective after you've finished the basic game. There's lots of secret holes as well, which are hidden in blades of grass or dirt blocks around the overworld. Sometimes these will have upgrades in them, and sometimes they provide shortcuts to underworld areas that are harder to get to normally. There are also parbots, robotic parrots that give you brief diary entries if you can destroy them in time, as well as a stroke bonus, much like you'd get from hitting regular birds. Look, I don't condone this, it's just part of the game. Starting to see why birds have a dim view of other species. It took a little bit of time for me to vibe with this game. It feels a little clunky at first and you can barely get anywhere. But the more my playing field expanded and the more I got used to the controls, the more I started to love it. That doesn't mean the game is flawless though. Much like actual golfing, there's a lot of frustration in your shots not going where you want them to. Thankfully, the game's free look button will tell you the slope directions, though I kind of wish it had a little more range so I could see what's at the end of a given path. But even with the upgrades, it can be frustrating to navigate some of the dungeon areas because it feels like there's not enough nuance to the power meter. Your shots either pathetically roll forward and backward, or you rocket them way past your target and end up in the water. The brakes help with this, but I can't help but wonder if the brakes were put in because of how unreliable the power curve is. But at the end of the day, Golfaria satisfies the main criteria for what I look for in a Zelda game. A go-anywhere world with lots of discovery and surprises, and plentiful rewards for overcoming challenges. I give this one an A. If you like slow and steady progression that involves constant upgrading and expanding exploration, you might enjoy Porgy, an underwater submarine game that sends you into the ocean depths to figure out why all the aquatic life has gone completely hostile. I can probably think of a few reasons. You'll start off in the shallow waters with just a small bit of fuel to survey a small radius around your base. But as you find fuel canisters and torpedo upgrades, you'll eventually be able to adventure further out and find new modules for your tank, like a missile that can destroy brittle rock formations or a drill for digging through dirt. Your fuel is also your life bar, so any damage to your sub ticks away precious seconds, and if you don't make it back to your base in time, any of your gotten gains gets lost and sent back to where they were first discovered. So you have to be careful in your trips not to get too greedy in seeking out upgrades. Although, man, if you can get several upgrades back to your base in one trip, it's a really satisfying feeling. Compounding this issue are the many bosses lurking at every layer of the sea, and though they'll leave you alone if you keep your distance, they will make it their life's mission to hunt you down if they spot your submarine, and until you get enough upgrades, you're just no match for their speed and strength, so you'll really have to play it safe until you can find a way of evening the odds. For me, it was the very powerful depth charge module, which allows you to carry 2 charges from your base to use for various purposes. And for me, one of those purposes was to destroy that dang shark, which happened right as they were destroying me. Thankfully, the game still awarded me with the kill, but man, I'm glad they didn't drop anything I'd have to take back with me, or I'd probably have been soft-locked. I'm a big fan of this one, though it's definitely a slower burn. You'll have to retry several trips because a boss caught you on the way back, or you just got too greedy and ran out of fuel. Slow and steady wins the race, but that's obviously not going to be exciting for all players. But I knew what I was getting into here, and you don't have to pull my leg too hard to get me interested in an underwater Metroidvania. I've already played through the aquatic adventures of The Last Human and Depths of Sanity in the past, and honestly, Porgy is probably more polished than the both of those combined. It'll definitely frustrate you at times, but I think it's worth diving deep into. Porgy gets an A-. Many genres get some love from UFO 50, but you might not have expected the point-and-click adventure. Night Manor draws some pretty direct inspiration from ICOM classics of old, like Uninvited and Deja Vu. You'll be traversing a spooky house, trying to evade a horrible killer while collecting inventory items and solving puzzles. Night Manor keeps things simple with just a look and interact cursor, which makes sense because you won't be using a mouse. It won't even work here. This is a controller-only affair, and that's perfectly fine. It actually increases the tension when the killer finds you, because your cursor will shake with fear, and it becomes intentionally cumbersome to get away and find a hiding spot. When you do, you'll play a bit of back and forth timing presses to keep your breath held until they leave. But be careful, because if you keep using the same hiding spot, it might not be there next time. The puzzles are all generally logical, and there's only one instance of what I'd legitimately call pixel hunting, though I definitely got stuck now and then not being sure of where to progress. But hey, that's adventure gaming, baby! The music and atmosphere are perfectly moody and ominous, and there's lots of neat little touches, like the killer's silhouette appearing during lightning strikes, sound-based interactions attracting the killer, and of course, copious journal entries to read. Unlike the ICOM games, you can't get stuck in an unwinnable situation, and even if the killer manages to get you, it's not a game over, so give yourself a few hours and you'll eventually find a way out, even if you don't get the ending you're hoping for. I give Night Manor an A. While there's no pointing and clicking with Mini and Max, I don't think anyone would scoff at calling this puzzle platformer hybrid an adventure game. There are puzzles and quests that require finding an item and putting it in your inventory to use later, but the game's got a lot of intersections going on here, not just in its influences, but in its weaving of UFO Soft's past and present into a charming world of crossovers. Let's start at the beginning though. Minnie's been locked in the closet by her bossy older sister who wants to throw a big party while their parents are out. In a party house, perhaps? For reasons too dumb to explain, Minnie finds out that she and her dog Max can shrink down to the size of an ant at will, and that's where the game begins. The closet essentially functions as a fast travel map, with each tile its own region of the shrunken world, and you'll encounter all sorts of tiny friends and foes to interact with, from literal dust bunnies to bug soldiers. At one point you'll even enter a book on war and find an actual war going on inside. What is this, Gumby? The combat of choice here involves picking up whatever's underneath you, and I know you're thinking Doki Doki Panic here, but I actually think Capcom's Rescue Rangers game is a more direct parallel. In addition to item fetching, there are also permanent upgrades which remind me a bit of the Monster World games, like armor that reduces damage in half, boots for higher jumping, or gloves for picking up enemies. Ultimately, the goal is to collect a bunch of stars, or shinies, so that you can reach the tyrannical King Mittens and beg to be let through the closet door's keyhole. But there's a lot to do before you even get there. This is a game with a lot of fun discovery to it. For example, you eventually get an item that lets you shrink even further to a molecular level, and there are places where you have to do it, but also, they really did just literally map out a second massive overworld in addition to the main one. Sure, a lot of it is just empty with some enemies here and there, but it's still a hell of an effort. There are also nods to various other UFO Soft games throughout Mini and Max, like a train you can enter which is full of enemies and items from the game Rail Heist. so that's just a ton of fun to find, and there are more surprises like that out in the world. In the lore, Mini and Max is sort of meant to be UFO Soft's big magnum opus before the studio falls on hard times, and I think the game lives up to that hype. I give it an A. So by now you're probably wondering, if this is a collection of retro-style games, are there retro-style cheat codes? Especially considering the difficulty of some of them, surely there's something to give me, a modern mom on the go, a leg up. Well, yes and no. There are cheat codes for just about every game in UFO 50, but none of them allow saving or a proper completion. But that doesn't mean they're worthless either. Each of them can be entered into the terminal feature of the main menu, along with other commands and secret stuff I'll talk about later. You've got your typical level select codes to help you practice those harder games, power-up codes to give you all the abilities, character codes to unlock special characters in certain games, option codes to fine-tune settings in Hotfoot, and in a couple of cases, special bonuses like this Scrapped Versus mode in Kick Club. While you can't use them to get an official clear, you can at least use them to get more comfortable with each game, until you can properly master them on your own. There are even codes to make the games harder if you're, for some reason I can't fathom, not feeling challenged enough. But for me, the most interesting one is the cheat code for Party House, VIPs only, which allows you to manually select a generated seed of party guests. This one seems cool because interesting or challenging seeds can be shared with the larger community, and I could definitely see certain categories becoming unofficial fan scenarios in the future. Now, would I like to see more cheat codes in future updates? Absolutely, because I think there's still a lot more you could do. It's neat that Hyper Contender has a stock mode, but maybe some reskins would be fun. Or hey, how about a big head mode? My recommendation though is to not seek these cheat codes out right away. Play the games as they are, or else you might have a completely different impression of some of them. Tactics pits two warring factions against each other in a mix of hectic real-time strategy and board game. Every turn takes just a couple of seconds as you quickly move pieces around on the board before they move forward. You can move them north to south as well as pull them back, which becomes important later as you reinforce some of your ranks pushing forward. Grunts are your standard attackers, archers will sit still and fire at range if they see an enemy, ninjas will fire throwing knives to their sides, shield men can block arrows, etc. It's quite good, and each level introduces either a new class or a new perilous situation to overcome. While the field and visuals stay the same, the gameplay itself makes up for the lack of graphical variety. You have a 24-level campaign which will take you at least a few hours, then a ranked mode which features every class available and gives you no indication of what's to come, and an endless survival mode. Out of all the early era games that I played, this one feels the most feature complete. The only thing I don't quite get about this game is the column mechanic. In the description for level 1, it states that grunts don't take damage in columns, but unless I'm missing something, they very much do take damage in columns, so maybe I'm just misunderstanding something there. But other than that, I highly enjoyed this one and I'll be coming back to it frequently. Tactics gets an A. When I started my first round of Avianos, I was instantly overwhelmed and my brain wanted to shut down. But as I continued to play, the nature of the game became much clearer, and folks, maybe I understand 4X games now? I always saw 4X games on Steam as this super nerdy, matches take 10 hours to finish kind of genre. I mean, maybe it still is that, but Avianos, like a car crusher, squishes the gameplay of a 4X into a little cube and makes it bite-sized. Now, bite-sized in this case still means matches can take up to an hour, but that's still far more digestible to pick up and play scenarios than the alternative, aside from the classic turn-by-email approach. This is one I can actually play in bed on my Steam Deck if I wanted, and could actually finish a match before falling asleep. Okay, but what do you actually do? Avianos depicts a post-apocalypse in which humans have gone extinct, and birds have become the dominant species on the planet, but even they have become territorial and are off to war. As each turn starts, you select one of several deities, each of which provides you with 3 different actions to take. Some are for harvesting resources, some are for bolstering your troops, and some are for insight and poking through the fog of war. The goal is to capture 4 castles and hold them for 2 rounds to win, but it's easier said than done. I was kind of fumbling about in my first first game still figuring out the mechanics, just to get absolutely slam-jammed by a massive army that reached my front door. Everything synergizes together, like gaining more units and resources depending on what installations you've placed on your tiles, or using those resources to recruit new soldiers. Because you generally won't know how many units your enemy has on each tile, there's a bit of guesswork and hope behind every decision you make, although you can reveal some tiles for a couple of turns with one deity. Do you leave one of your castles vulnerable so you can push the offensive? Do you sneak around the back way and capture all the tiles the enemy left behind? I could see this being a physical board game with figurines, although I don't know how you'd handle the Fog of War. I guess you couldn't, huh? Some board game fanatic's gonna educate me in the comments, I'm sure. Avianos is a solid strategy game that can be a graceful introduction to the 4X genre and a relatively short-form package. Though it would have been nice to have some sort of instruction manual. I give it a B+. One of my absolute favorite games in this entire collection is maybe the most unassuming at a glance. It's a card-style game called Party House, and the goal is to eventually attract enough VIP guests to have a 4-star party. You do this by hosting nightly parties and collecting popularity points and cash, and then use those in between each round to invite new types of guests and expand the house to add more slots. Each scenario has its own collection of unique party crashers, from auctioneers that bring in tons of cash, to troublemakers that will score you big, so long as you don't have so many of them that the cops show up, because if they do, you get nothing that night. There are a lot of guests that synergize with others, which is where a lot of the strategy comes into play. The hippie can cancel out one troublemaker, the photographer can score a guest's points before the round is over, others can clear out the room for a clean slate, and even others give you bonuses depending on who else is at the party. Eventually, you'll have enough popularity points to buy those VIP guests, and they too can have unique abilities or downsides to keep in mind. The mermaid, for example, will always invite a friend, and that friend could be a troublemaker that gets your party shut down. Dinosaurs are troublemakers, so you'll need to find a way to cancel that out to win with them. It's such brilliant design, and the press your luck nature is incredibly addictive. You will lose several nights to flat out bad luck sometimes, but there's more than enough nights in front of you to turn that luck around with the right strategy. This may not have all the bells and whistles of the other UFO Soft games, but don't let looks deceive you. And actually, I really dig the kinda Maniac Mansion style character designs, and just gaze upon that glorious title screen. Party House gets an A+. Lords of Disconia is a curious mashup of turn-based strategy, board game, and billiards. As you move your piece on the board, you'll collect gold and use it to recruit soldiers for your army, in preparation for the inevitable conflict with a computer or human opponent. These battles play out in turn-based fashion in a way similar to the old iOS game Squid's Odyssey. Does anyone remember that? You aim and power up your shot, and then blast your Beyblade battalion across the field, damaging enemies and hopefully picking up health and gold along the way. Each unit type has its own amount of turns and attack styles, like the archers who can stay put and fire a powerful arrow from afar, or the ogres who can deal powerful damage but only act once. You can also pick up perks along the way to the battlefield by collecting the scrolls, which can help your units in various ways, like having more ammunition or having more units to choose between at the start of your turn. If you can manage to knock one enemy into another, you'll deal extra damage to both, so lining up your shots means more than just firing straight, but banking them for maximum efficiency. The loser of the battle is sent back to their base to collect their reserve soldiers, and whoever runs out of soldiers first loses the entire match. While the other strategy games in UFO 50 require a lot of heavy thought and planning several steps ahead, Lords of Disconia is just good, dumb fun. You'll mess up plenty, laugh at your mistakes, and maybe you'll lose, but you'll have a fun time doing it. I give Lords of Disconia a B+. So this one is kind of tricky to review because on top of being a massive collection of retro games, UFO 50 also has a lot of behind-the-scenes lore to puzzle out, and I feel like Combatants is part of that lore. There's a lot of studio turmoil that's implied, and producer Tao Nomura is seemingly the source of most of the conflict. It seems as if Campanella 3, for example, was written to essentially permanently end the franchise, in order to take the studio in a more hip and edgy direction. So when you see the credits credits on some games towards the end of the chronology, all of the legacy employees at UFO Soft have become mere initials, either because they didn't want to be credited or because Mr. Nemuru wanted to de-emphasize their importance. So when you look at Combatant's extra info and it describes the game as Mr. Nemuru's grand vision, it's hard not to read that as tongue-in-cheek. And when playing the game, it does feel like something is just kinda off about it. AI has trouble rounding corners, levels don't seem particularly fairly designed, and the storytelling is far more blunt and overt. So, at least to me, it seems like Combatants is meant to be bad on purpose? For the lore? Okay, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but the fact remains that Combatants is bad. It's an RTS where your soldiers are complete idiots who barely even follow you when you order them to. You're supposed to deliver food back to your queen in order to create more workers and soldiers, but the enemy team is suspiciously smarter and faster at doing it every time. It's entirely possible that there's just a flaw out of fiction with the AI, but either way, it doesn't matter to me what the underlying reason is, I just don't find it fun to fight against the game. I won't give Combatants an F, because I do think having an intentionally bad game in the collection is kind of funny, but this is the most generous I've ever been in giving a game a D. Another genre I wouldn't have expected to show up in a retro compilation is tower defense, but that's exactly what Rock On Island is all about. Set in the prehistoric era, you're trying to defend your home from dinosaurs, saber-toothed tigers, pteranodons, and other anachronistic creatures that would make a natural historian jump off the nearest bridge. Armed with meat, the only currency that matters to cavemen, you hire and upgrade soldiers to fight off the advancing hordes. You can build campfires to speed your fighters up, and you can place chickens, which yield additional meat between rounds to help build your money up faster. I'm a big fan of tower defense, and Rock On Island's style of tower defense reminds me a lot of the minigame from 3D Dot Game Heroes. You can in fact get in the fray and attack enemies yourself, although your basic throne boat won't do a lot of damage to later enemies, so you'll have to decide on whether you want to spend precious money to upgrade yourself. Careful placement, mid-wave upgrade management, and class combinations are the key to victory here. Enemies can be weaker against spears or rock, or they might be weak to fire. You'll have to plan ahead for what's to come in later waves while you're fighting existing ones. That being said, this isn't the brainiest tower defense out there. As it turns out, a combination of tar and firefighters does tremendous damage to most of the enemies in this game, with bows not far behind. So the strategy is mostly boiled down to getting all your cavemen upgraded to those classes across the map. Maybe that'll change in future patches, but I haven't come across an encounter yet that hasn't been decimated by this tactic. So that's probably bad? I still like the game and all. Not every game has to be a nightmare to complete, okay? This is more of a snack to come back to over time than a full-course meal. Rock On Island gets a B. Paint Chase is a strange combination of Rally X and Splatoon, where your goal is to leave more of your color paint on the ground than your enemies before time runs out. All of the action is confined to one screen, with your time limit on the right. Enemies range from basic paint rollers to airplanes that explode with paint in 8 directions to slugs that travel slowly but multiply. There are also triggers on the ground that will either switch elevated blocks like a Zelda dungeon, or activate one of several highly useful power-ups, from multi-directional paint guns to a drone that goes off on its own and paints part of the track for you. When time runs out, you get a Splatoon-esque percentage tally, and if you clear the bar, you're on to the next level, or you lose one of your 3 lives and have to try the level again. There are tiny little Pac-Man-esque skits that play out between some levels, which I always think is cute. The music's alright, not one of the more memorable tracks in this selection, and the visuals are pretty utilitarian. I think you could have possibly had scrolling levels here if you were willing to put a minimap on screen, but I get why they didn't. Overall, I'd say this one is okay, but it didn't knock my socks off, which is a shame because I do like maze games and the old Rally X music gets stuck in my head all the time. But I think the action here is just not crunchy or juicy enough for me. Paint Chase gets a C. Magic Garden is a quasi-snake-style score chaser where you gather together a bunch of oppies and then lead them to star markers and drop them off in order to rescue them, while trying not to hit walls or yourself. I know this is an arcade-style game, and I know that the developers said that none of the games in UFO 50 are minigames, but folks, they're really not beating the allegations on this one at least. Yeah, it's an arcade-style game, but it's very simple, and the only thing that changes as you play is the progression of the seasons, which only mildly changes the aesthetic and doesn't bring any new enemies or hazards to the stages. You also get a game over after just one hit, which can be very frustrating if you just run out of time on the power pellet-esque potions that allow you to knock enemies out and get killed by an enemy. This one needed another pass, I think, to provide a bit more iteration, though I admit that a lot of people on the internet are really liking this game. I just think it needs something more. Magic Garden gets a D. Now, I've been a little mean to the arcade games so far, but Kick Club is the kind of game that if I saw it on Steam, I'd gladly buy it alone. It's a sports-themed tribute to Bubble Bobble, but instead of blowing bubbles to trap enemies, you're kicking a soccer ball into their face. That kinda rules, honestly. The game has 4 worlds with 10 stages each and multiple bosses, and although there aren't any continues, I could see myself eventually mastering this game and taking it to the end zone. The movement is responsive and the kicking is perfect, although I'm of 2 minds about the soccer ball coming to a near-complete stop on hitting an enemy. This of course allows you to more easily retrieve your ball if you're hitting from close range, but I wouldn't have minded a bit more of a ricochet effect. Maybe they could add an occasionally spawning super ball that passes through enemies and just bounces all over the place like crazy. I don't know. But this is a polished, super fun game that is easy to pick up and tricky to finish. If you're not playing through UFO 50 chronologically, I would pick Kick Club as the one you should play first. It gets an A+. Overbold, not to be confused with Overblood, is an arena shooter that's vaguely like Smash TV, but without the ability to fire away from your body. You have to go through 8 fights to win enough cash to buy a spaceship to replace the one you lost in Valgress. Yeah, it's a sorta semi-sequel. And as the name would indicate, you can up the ante if you feel bold enough, which will increase the amount of enemies you have to fight. But you're gonna need to do it because between rounds you'll be purchasing upgrades, and the final match is a massive marathon of enemies and a boss, so you'll have to get good enough at the game that you can start betting big money right at the start. You can upgrade your hit points, place medkits on the field, increase your shot power and fire rate, plant deadlier bombs that fire off shrapnel, and more. By far the most overpowered upgrade is the Lure, which pulls enemies towards your bombs in hilarious fashion. This is another very short game. A winning run will take you 10 minutes, though it'll probably take you around an hour to get to that point where you can confidently reach that final match with plenty of upgrades. I'd like a bit more visual variety to it, and I bet you'd like that too, so let's quickly move on to the next game. Overbold gets a C+. I don't know when belt action became the popular term to refer to beat-em-ups, but decades of inertia combined with even more decades of apathy have kept the term beat-em-up in my mind with no room for anything else. Belts only have one action, and that's to try to use it like a whip when you're 8 years old and want to be Indiana Jones. Just kidding, that's not something I did. It's actually for using with a bungee cord you found in your dad's shed to try to imitate the sports on Nickelodeon Guts, but you just end up pulling out one of the ceiling tiles. just kidding, that's so random that I just came up with that just now. Fist Hell's a beat-em-up resting somewhere between Double Dragon and River City Ransom, with a fun art style and lots of nasties to punch, pipes to swing, and floor food to chomp down on. While it isn't as complex as the modern-day beat-em-ups that have pushed the genre forward, there are still a few additions that pace it ahead of its 80s contemporaries, like a dash and dash attack, a charge attack, blocking, and the ability to improve one of your 3 stats between levels. Recovery time is actually kind of important here because you're very vulnerable and have just the 1 life per continue. If you do continue, you'll be put back at the beginning of the current stage, which in most games would be relatively generous, but in a beat-em-up it's a pretty steep penalty. The stages are luckily not too long, but it can be easy to get juggled and drop in health quickly, so you'll have to play pretty defensively, which might not be everyone's cup of tea in this sort of game. I know I could put a ton of quarters into the Simpsons arcade game just to hurl endless homers at bosses in futility. One odd thing about the game is the weakness of held weapons. Whether it's pipes or throwing knives, they just don't seem to do all that much damage and seem kinda pointless outside of giving you slightly more range. Still, I don't think this is a bad game, it's definitely enjoyable, but I wouldn't have minded if it leaned more on the River City Ransom side and allowed for a little more character building. I'll give this one a B-. This one falls in that category of games I recognize are well designed, but I am just too incompetent to actually make much headway in it. Onion Delivery plays like a mix of Crazy Taxi and the original Grand Theft Auto. This plays out from a top-down perspective and results in kinda awkward controls. Rather than orient to the directional pad, you steer left and right, which of course gets awkward when you're facing south. It's not unusual for a driving game of this era to control that way, it's just difficult for me to keep on top of, especially with the other demands of the game, because you're not just delivering onions to various customers, but also dealing with various threats like gangsters, zombies, bad weather, and more, which are randomly determined on a day-to-day basis. After you finish your deliveries, you have an opportunity to continue to deliver onions, or you can return back home to finish your run, and during this time you're still very vulnerable. Lose all your hearts and it's game over. Luckily you restore your hearts with deliveries, and you can also regain a heart by driving at max speed, which is an interesting risk-reward mechanic that I was a bit too cowardly to shoot for a lot of the time because I was already fairly bad at navigating through traffic. With 7 straight days of deliveries in the game's campaign, this might be one of the hardest games in the entire collection. It took a friend of mine 12 hours to finally have a winning run, so if you're the kind of person who wants a giant challenge to overcome, then this one might be for you. It's just not something I ever expect to finish myself. Onion Delivery gets a B+. There's a trio of games under the same banner in UFO 50, the franchise that gave UFO Soft their namesake. Campanella, a game starring a little UFO, would spawn multiple iterations and spin-offs, so it's only fair to talk about all of them here, starting with the original. Much like the arcade classic Lunar Lander, you need to keep firing your thrust to keep your UFO afloat, and touching just about anything will kill you. Luckily, you do have the ability to slash and destroy enemies, and you'll need to do it often because filling your green bar will give you an extra life, and you're gonna need as many lives as you can get to finish this game, because there are 50 stages and no save points. There are other ways to rack up points as well, like circling around a light-up pad or grabbing a green coin which spawns others to pick up in a short time window, as well as a mid-world bonus stage where you slash an ever-expanding amount of crystals before you're unable to destroy them all in time. Lastly, there are secret coffee mugs in each level that spawn if you hover your ship in certain locations on the map. There's a double-digit life counter for a reason, and you'll find it's just as easy to rack up extra lives as it is to lose them, especially if you get into an impatience streak and make sloppy mistakes. Now, I know for the narrative this game has to be a success for the game to be called UFO 50, but in a real-world context, I'm not so sure this game would be a Mario-type hit. It's kind of awkward and really stressful to play, and though I had fun with it, I'd be surprised if this was anyone's favorite in the collection. I do love the aesthetic of the different worlds, including the diner world, and the evil ghost that chases you in World 3, so there is a lot of variety packed into this little title, but even despite that, this is kinda hard to love. After I beat it, I'm unlikely to go back. I give it a C. After Campanella was an unexpected success, UFO Soft would quickly rush a multiplayer spin-off out onto the market called The Big Bell Race. As you might have guessed, this is a racing game, somewhat of a rarity in this collection. It's a top-down racer that continues the thrust-based controls of Campanella, but with 7 other ships also jockeying for first place across 8 tracks. There's a little bit of Mario Kart to the game as there are power pickups like fireballs, mines, a ball and chain, and others. Thankfully no blue shell here, and also no rubber banding, which does mean that it's relatively easy to win races because once you get out in front of the pack, you're no longer at risk of your ship getting destroyed because everyone else is too busy fighting with each other. This is another game that feels more like a prototype than a finished product. I do really like the looks of the different tracks, but I think this should have had at least 3 different cups instead of a single block of 8. Maybe even additional speed options like Mario Kart had. There is some fun to be had in multiplayer, but there's only a 2-player option, which is accurate to the limitations of the console, but man, I don't know. Nintendo did make the 4-score, which you could use to play several NES games with 4 people, like Spot the Video Game. Okay, bad example, sorry. Surely they could have had a 4-player option here. I give The Big Bell Race a D. That brings us to Campanella 2, which may look similar on the surface but plays completely differently. While the first Campanella was a room-by-room arcade game, the second is more akin to a roguelite. The protagonist of the first game has been kidnapped, and it's up to his sister to free him from captivity through 4 different 2-part stages. Campanella 2 has been compared to Spelunky by several UFO 50 fans, and that's probably a fair comparison to make. Blaster Master is the other obvious one, as the game combines ship combat and on-foot shooting. But unlike Blaster Master, you only have 1 life to complete the entire game. Shops and treasure chests offer item choices without an explanation for what they do, ghosts chase you through tunnels, and your ship needs constant refueling. Picking up stars adds fuel to your ship, and 5 stars will open the tunnel to the next location and shut all the other doors in the stage. These other doors can provide free pickups, or vendors, or a scroll quest that tracks across multiple levels. So, I think this game is probably well designed, but I irrationally don't like it very much. Part of it is the procedurally generated level design, which lacks unique or interesting landmarks and can result in disorienting navigation, which is not great when you run out of fuel very quickly. But I also think there's a certain elegance to the original Spelunky that's a bit missing here. Spelunky has a risk-reward element to it that fits very well with its Indiana Jones theming, and any screw-up can easily be blamed on the player. Not so much with Campanella 2, which can spit out levels that just don't really make a whole lot of sense in their layouts, with ladders that lead nowhere and pathways to dead ends. The only risk and reward is to farm coins for shop vendors, but honestly, you're more likely to finish the game if you just beeline directly to the stars and avoid everything else. I did that, by the way, I did finish the game that way. Sure, you can find a treasure chest behind some red doors, but if you take any damage along the way, that's already a net loss and you'll have to buy gum if it's available to refuel your health. And if you run out of fuel, you'll hemorrhage coins like crazy, and fuel burns just too damn quickly. With more fine-tuning, this could have been something I enjoyed, but as it stands, I give Campanella 2 a C-. To this point, Campanella has mostly confined you to your UFO, but the next Campanella game goes in a wildly different direction. Pilot Quest is a spin-off that combines a timed Legend of Zelda quest with the resource automation of an idle game. Pilot's UFO is crashed on planet Zoldath, the same as the game that bears its namesake. As you build up your home base, you'll acquire meat, which allows you to enter the overworld for a brief amount of time, to explore, find quests and ship parts, and hopefully make it back before time runs out. While you don't have a life bar, enemy contact docks precious seconds from your time, so you'll have to be careful with how much you engage with them. But you will have to do it, as some enemies will yield special currency which can be used to activate teleporters for quicker overworld travel. You'll also need special resources from the overworld to utilize the research tree back at home, from upgrading your attack yo-yo to improving your storage capacity. You'll also plant seeds to automate moondrops, the primary resource of the game, which can be converted into ingots and used to build workshops, houses, and silos. These houses attract citizens who can then be put to work to automate ingot production, and so on and so forth. I don't get as deep into idle games as others do, but I definitely see the addictive qualities at play here. As long as you have UFO 50 running, your workers will keep on producing until you return. Now, the idle production kinda tops out after a while, so I wouldn't say that this game is primarily leaning in that direction, but if you run out of meat, you will have to stop playing for a while to let it regenerate. Honestly, this is a weird one, it's kinda hard to grade, but I like it more than the first 2 Campanella games by far. I'll give Pilot Quest a B-. As cold as I've been to this franchise within a franchise, the third game in the Campanella series is the one that finally fit into place for me. Campanella 3 takes the series into the third dimension, with a behind-the-back shooter that's not unlike Space Harrier. Confined to a small square, your UFO can shoot into the distance or on the same plane, though you can only fire the latter in the opposite direction you're facing. Each level has 4 waves of relentless enemies and a boss, some of which attack you from afar, and others which wait until they're at your level to become a nuisance. If you can clear out a high percentage of enemies throughout the stage, you'll unlock a bonus challenge which will award a continue if you can pop enough balloons to reach 50 points. Much like other games in UFO 50, continues don't put you right back in the action, but move you back to the beginning of the stage you died in, but they're still highly useful. This one is fun and frantic, and it's an enjoyable challenge to try to 100% every wave. The odd thing is the bosses, which are weirdly easy by comparison. Yeah, I died a few too many times to the level 2 boss until I realized I could push the hands apart with my side fire, but once I figured that out, I don't think a single boss pushed me very hard. It was actually kind of a relief to reach them if I still had a full life bar. There's a decent amount of stages here, and enough variety to the stages and enemies that it stays exciting the whole way through. While I don't love the Campanella franchise, at least it goes out on a pretty high note. I give Campanella 3 an A-. Now, before I move on to the next section, there's just one small little detail about Campanella 3 that I didn't mention yet. See, in that top bar there's a screen where your sister occasionally chimes in. Well, some intrepid puzzle solvers found out that a certain button combination pulls up a special version of UFO 50 inside UFO 50. So, I guess if I'm being thorough, that means Dodge has you weaving around constantly spawning enemies. It's pretty simple, I give it a C. Bricks is basically Arkanoid, and I like Arkanoid, so I'll give that an A for Arkanoid. Bird is about staying in the air while avoiding projectiles and collecting coins. It's okay, I give it a B-. Find has you searching for a hidden smiley face by revealing arrows on a grid. Pretty bland, that's a D. Sword is dodge with a sword, swords make everything better, so that's a B. Mines shows you a grid of mines and then hides them as you make your way to the goal. Neat concept, that's a B+. Fishing is not actually about fishing, but avoiding fish, at least I think it is? C-. Tunnel is an auto-scroller, you've seen these a ton. That's a C. In Skater you collect the gold rocks and ignore the red ones. Way too basic, D. Boss is a bullet hell encounter that's honestly pretty fun, A+. Sniper is about shooting the bird while avoiding the UFOs. It's okay, C+. Drops involves popping a drop of water at the right time. I don't really get this one, D. Dodge 2 adds smoother movement and coins, but where's the sword? B-. Wanted adds chasing enemies every time you collect a coin. Kinda neat idea here, B. Bats is just endless space invaders, C-. Defend is actually pretty interesting, a take on missile command where each laser is tied to a specific button or direction I'll press. I can see this being expanded on in the future, A. Mash it is literally just pressing a button fast. That's it, that's all you do, D. Hearts is a memory game about finding hearts. The UFO letters are in there, that's cute, C. Bopper is Arkanoid with enemies rather than bricks. It's not as fun, C+. Aliens is a shooting gallery that never gets more difficult, C-. Hopper is a quick reaction platformer about jumping over hurdles. Too fast for me, my brain is old, C. Pool has you collecting coins while firing yourself all over the place. Feels like a parody of my worst Golfaria shots, B-. Sword 2 adds walls, and that's a bit too much for me. Whatever happened to the simplicity of Sword 1? This collection's really gone downhill. Mimic has you controlling 2 players at once dodging rocks. Another neat one, B+. Stop 'em is just one at a time space invaders, D. Turret has you firing in a rotation to keep enemies from reaching you. I've played this kind of game before, it's alright, B-. Racing is kinda like the part of Battletoads everyone hates, D. Strike is a timing-based game about striking an umbrella with lightning. Just not much to this one, C-. Platz is an auto-runner platformer where you try to avoid falling in the water. It's pretty solid, B. Boss 2 has a much larger boss to take down, but the attack pattern is the same. Give me a different one, A-. Arena is like one bit overbold. Interesting to see a D-make in here, B. Melt is about staying alive as long as possible on a melting platform. I glitched this one and the platform stopped melting, A+. Search is about finding little bugs. That's cute, I'll give that an A. Obey is basically bop it. Obviously, that's a B. Whoa, check out that fluid animation. Gotta give it an A+ because it has the most graphics in it. Cherry is just push a button when you see a cherry? Is this secretly an aptitude test? D. More is about guessing which color there's more of on screen. Didn't like it in Mario Party, don't like it here. D. Duel is a quick draw battle. Did like it in Kirby, and I like it here. B+. Bouncy is like Hopper, but you automatically jump. Nah, C. Coins is like those game shows where they fill a phone booth with money. That's very retro, so I'll give it an A. In Push 'em, enemies can't be killed, but they can be pushed backward to create a path for you to sneak through. This would actually be a neat mechanic in a bigger shoot 'em up, A-. Juggle is multi-ball Arkanoid, but without bricks, it's just not the same, C-. Teleport is like Hopper, but you move on a wide grid to dodge rather than on the ground. Kinda weird. C. Crowd is like that part of Battletoads everyone hates, but you have a gun now. That makes it a little better, so C+. Run Gun allows you to contra it up on a slowly scrolling screen as enemies pass through. No spread gun. D. I Spy is basically red light green light but with creepy eyes. I'll give this a C because that's what eyes do. Weeds is another one that I could see expanded out as you shoot at rapidly expanding vines to stop their growth. A+. Boss 3 has a— wait a minute, that's not even a ship, that's a guy! That's just a guy shooting at you with gun feet. D, because I don't condone murder. Telemine brings back the memory mines but uses the wide grid movement from Teleport. I'm too stupid for this one, C-. Lastly, Mugs has you swapping facial features to match the guy on the right. Suddenly fun art direction. Definitely reminds me of Flash games, that's an A-. And in fact, most of these games really reminded me of those old 1001 LCD handhelds that I'd see back in high school, so while obviously that was a bit of a joke segment, it was a nice flash of nostalgia. Shortly after though, I'd get a Neo Geo Pocket Color and that destroyed the shit out of those things. So nice try, UFO 50, but I'll go back to playing my extremely microscopic puzzle bobble, thank you. Bushido Ball is intense, to say the least. If you're familiar with games like Windjammers, then you basically know what to expect here. A variation on Pong where your paddles are people who have weaponry and special moves to utilize in 1v1 matches that count to 8 for victory. Each fighter has their own secondary weapon and super move, whether it's firing a knuckleball or making the ball invisible or causing it to make a sharp 90-degree turn. And the weapons can be used to re-angle the ball or stun your opponent. You can block the ball with your body, but it will stun you too. This is a game for people with much quicker reaction times than I, though I was able to beat it after about 1,000 continues. I do appreciate having the continue function though. I kinda wonder where it's been in some of the earlier games. Probably one of the prettiest title screens I've seen so far, and each of the 6 fighters has their own arena, though they don't have any impact on gameplay itself. If this were ever spun off into a standalone title, I'd expect that to change. You could get some conveyor belts in there, or spike traps or something, I don't know, just workshopping. This is another one that isn't really in my wheelhouse, but I can recognize that it's solid. I'll give it a B-. By comparison, Hotfoot might not be as stressful, but it's even more chaotic. In the vein of the old Kunio-kun dodgeball games, beanbags are tossed onto the court, and you have to hurl them at your opponents while jumping and dodging theirs. At the start, you choose between 2 of 5 randomly chosen characters, each with their own trait and special abilities. Some can suck the beanbags into their hand, some unleash a tidal wave, some throw bombs, and others throw boomerangs. They each have various strengths and weaknesses, as well as hidden stats not mentioned. Take this Eye Patch Kid for example. He can throw wavy beanbags that look almost impossible to dodge. Don't worry, the AI finds a way. But he also takes longer to get up after falling than others, making him a sitting duck. There are 6 matches, which is a bit of a marathon, and it can be frustrating to lose not because of your own mistakes, but because of factors outside your control. The companion AI, for example, is just not very good. They never shoot, and they will move into the line of fire very often. If a bomb is thrown on your side of the court, the AI always seems to want to walk right over to it, and you have to switch players just to keep them away. You can also get hit on the backwards ricochet, or you can get hit by trying to pick up a beanbag that hadn't quite stopped enough. A lot of annoyed grunts escaped me playing this one, so that colors my grade a little bit, I guess, but I also would have liked to have seen some other arenas, like an outdoor court or something. I'm giving this one a C-. My favorite sports game, though, would have to be Pin Golf, a side-scrolling futuristic golf game that is as easy to pick up as it is to break the golf club over your knee in anger.
And take a look at that. Take that, don't want that, don't want that.
You pick one of 5 golfers and set off to win a round of 18 holes by aiming, swinging, and hoping not to hit the many obstacles in your way. Because this is also inspired by pinball, and so there are bumpers to deal with, pegs, and some very wild stage layouts. And also the circus is everywhere? I blame the event organizers for that one. Pin golf is, admittedly, pretty tough. At first you will flail desperately, missing over and over, as the competition plays golf like actual professionals and rockets past you. But give it time. I mean, sure, in my first game I finished in last place with a +27, but as Tiger Woods once said, There's no sense in going to a tournament if you don't believe that you can win it. So I immediately started over and got a 27 again. Tiger Woods also drove his car into a tree and cheated on his wife, so... Of course I knew I'd have to cheat too, which the game allows with a special action called Dunk Ball, which spikes your ball down no matter where it's at in the air. This can help you slam a ball right into the cup, or keep your ball from sailing into a hazard. And with this new advantage at my side, I finished in 5th place. Which is not last place, so I'm improving little by little. But seriously, I really do like this one. I love the aesthetics, the physics feel fair, and you feel like you're getting better with each round. Pin Golf finishes well under par with a solid A. This one is listed officially under sports, but it's actually more of a platform fighter minus the ring outs. Hyper Contender pits you against 7 other opponents in an arena where the goal is simply to collect 5 rings first, and that includes collecting your opponent's rings by knocking it out of them. Each fighter has their own style of platforming and weapon of choice, as well as 2 defensive maneuvers, although if I'm being honest, I didn't really use the block much because it seems like it only works maybe against close-range melee attacks, and most of each fight is just dodging each other's projectile attacks. Like Bushido Ball, there are multiple arenas, which I always appreciate, and you can ask for a rematch if you lose a fight, although you can only do this once per opponent. There's also an options menu with difficulty options? Okay, Mossmouth, I really like UFO 50, but how was this not a thing in most of the other games? I understand the earliest ones, but you're telling me Campanella or Caramel can't have options menus? Really? We'll get into those later, though. Fighting against the AI is okay, although it really seems like the only difficulty is in the potential fighter mismatches. To give one example, Voltana's movement is fairly slow, and a fighter like Rek can definitely harass them. There's also a draft battle mode where you and an opponent select 5 fighters and they each fight each other. This one feels a little tacked on and not much different. The main draw for this game, though, is going to be multiplayer, as that's what it's obviously been designed for, with a mix of offensive and defensive tactics. I wouldn't expect to see it at EVO anytime soon, but I'm sure it'll have its own small fan base. I give Hyper Contender a B-. If you've ever had a late-night Newgrounds binge or downloaded games to your calculator in high school, then you might be familiar with the type of grungy game that Quibble Race is inspired by. Quibble Race is horse racing with cheating. Well, more cheating anyway. The goal is to earn more winnings than your fellow gamblers, and each of you are looking for a leg up. Before each race, you're given a few options, from sabotaging one of the quibbles to using steroids, and you can also spend your earnings to get hints on racer attributes. Once you're locked in, the game will show each of the players' cheats and whether they got away with it or not, and then the race begins. Again, this is horse racing, you can't control the racers, just what happens to them. With any luck, you'll bet on a long shot and win big, and you can use that money to sponsor quibbles, which will yield you a ton of cash if they win, even if you don't bet on them. In this sense, a master player could essentially rig the entire league in their favor, and it's definitely satisfying to see your plans pay off. But there are some checks and balances put in place. As mentioned before, if you're caught cheating, it won't activate, and some cheats affect a runner across multiple races, which could result in a lineup that won't yield any real profit. Also, some quibbles retire or even die, so even if you train one up, it might not get enough opportunities to make the investment worth it. I like Quibble Race, but it's definitely got some rougher edges, and it's as RNG dependent as you'd expect a game about gambling to be. I give it a B-. If you're looking for something more along the lines of Sokoban, then Block Koala is your best bet. It's a numerical block pusher with a quirky rule set, where only equal or higher numbered blocks can push the lower numbered blocks with them. Of course, this isn't the only rule. There are new types of blocks that show up later on, and having to figure out how they work is sort of part of the fun. But once again, I am on my knees, arms thrust to the heavens, begging, pleading for instruction manuals for these games, because I know that other people might stall out without a little guidance, and it'd suck for them to miss out on some of these games, just because they don't pick up on mechanics or rules as quickly as others. Solving puzzles will grant a star and restore a tree in the park, though as far as I've gotten into the game, this only means a tree pops up in the same place outside of the playing field, and you use those stars to open locked gates and progress further into the park. The game is vaguely non-linear like a Draconic game, in that you can do the puzzles in any order, and gates don't require every level completed to open, so you can always skip a level and come back to it later if you feel like, and there's unlimited undo so you can fix any and all mistakes that you make along the way. It's also the first game I've seen in this collection that comes with a level editor, which is always fun, and they provide letter codes so you can allow other players on the internet to give them a try. It's a good game with pleasing art design and puzzles that ramp up in difficulty very quickly. My only real complaint is that the single tune that plays during levels gets a bit repetitive. This might be one for your podcast audio. Black Koala gets a B+. Bug Hunter is somewhere in between a puzzle and strategy game, with a feel not completely unlike Into the Breach. The goal is to kill enough alien bugs to get them to scatter away and retreat, and doing so is much trickier than you might think. They start off as larvae, but slowly evolve turn by turn into deadlier enemies, and then lay eggs which, if hatched, cause an instant game over. So your job is constantly being thwarted by damage control, as you have to deal with threats present and future. You have 8 actions per turn, each in a customizable slot that can be swapped out with enough energy from the capsule menu. So you could expel all your actions, then spend energy to swap in new moves, and extend your turn further. These actions range from basic movement, to jumps that allow you to get on elevated ledges, to teleportation, and attacks that go in a straight line and pierce multiple enemies, diagonally, or ranged attacks that only hit one enemy but can hit higher elevations. There are also special modules that can turn the tide of battle, like an ability that reduces enemies in a 9-tile area back to their larval forms, or an ability that refreshes all of your attack modules. Now, you're not able to win prematurely by clearing out all of the bugs in one turn, but as long as you completely fill out your kill meter before the end of the final day, you'll finish the job and be able to move on to the next one. The game thankfully has a save and quit option between jobs, so that gives the game a little bit more pick up and playability, but if you lose, it's back to job 1. Bug Hunter is highly addictive and definitely has that one more go energy to it, and whenever a new module appears, I'm excited to see how I can best utilize it. I'll give this game a B+. Devolition is one of those games that I can recognize as good, but I'm simply too stupid to master it. At first, when you start the game, it might seem a bit overwhelming, like what am I even doing here? But the goal is to create a series of chain reactions that destroys all of the demons on the board without killing the humans. Each monster you place has their own blast radius, and it's sort of up to you to remember where those are after you've placed them. There's no time limit here, so take your time and don't misplace your guys, because otherwise you'll feel like an idiot when your Rube Goldberg terrorism machine fizzles out prematurely. I think for me, it's that exact thing that is holding me back from progressing further in the game, because even though the monster sprites sometimes have a visual indicator on the sprite itself to show where they'll explode, I'll still forget and misplace a creature, or I'll forget which one I was supposed to fire off first. I think my brain is bad, guys. That's not good. Uh-oh. Regardless, I think this is a good game, but one I might not return to for a while until I watch other people play it and learn some tricks. Who knows, maybe there is a way to highlight all the blast areas on the board, I just didn't see one. Although honestly, I think the memorization is kind of the point. I'm grading this one I'll give it a B, because my ineptitude is the only thing keeping me from embracing it. I think if you're the kind of player that likes to think several moves ahead in a game like Puyo Puyo or Puzzle League, you're gonna really like this one, and probably get way further than I did. Now this one, I'm just barely smart enough to finish. Camouflage is a tale of survival and color swapping, as you, the lowly chameleon, must escape from predators looking to bare their teeth and make deviant art out of you by matching your color to whatever terrain you're standing on. Enemies have a 3-tile wide vision cone that extends as far as the eye can see, unless it's blocked by logs or rocks, and that's where a lot of the puzzle solving happens. While it would be tricky but less stressful to simply get to the goal, there are 2 optional fruits and a baby chameleon to pick up as well. The baby is the tough part, as they follow behind you, so your single tile shenanigans won't work anymore. It's a really clever puzzle game that shows it's designed to you intuitively so you can pick it up fairly quickly, and there are small little touches that make a lot of sense after you discover them. For example, you can't change colors while in sight of an enemy, but you can use them as a sightline blocker if they happen to move in front of another enemy. Camouflage isn't one of the longer puzzle games, it's one you can likely 100% within 3 hours, but I'm fine with the game not overstaying its welcome as long as each individual puzzle maintains a consistent level of quality, and they definitely do. A lot of aha moments await you as Camouflage gets a B+. Now it's time for some tactical espionage action, as Rail Heist takes the stealth, strategy, and platforming genres and rolls them all up into a puzzly stromboli that serves up to 2 people. As a band of outlaws, you'll be boarding increasingly dangerous trains looking for their prize cargo and attempting to leave with it in one piece. If you get too close to a lawman's vision cone, you'll instantly be shot and killed, so you'll have to find creative ways around them. The levels are quasi-sandboxes with various potential solutions in front of you, whether it's going guns blazing, which is not recommended because it takes a while to load your gun, throwing metal crates at enemies to kill them, punching enemies to stun them, or doing your best not to be noticed at all. You can even punch through walls and ceilings like you're Adam Jensen, so what do we say, folks? Immersive sim, huh? I'm half joking, don't crawl through a vent and sneak up on me. If you make a noise or stun an enemy, the game becomes turn-based, and you'll need to either deal with the threat quickly or find a place to hide. You can also use chickens to draw enemy fire, and I guess that makes their guns jam? Because after that, they can only use their fists. I like this game quite a bit, though like all stealth games, I'm kinda bad at it. Each level has additional star objectives like clearing the level quickly, avoiding casualties, or going sicko mode, so there's a lot to do if you want to get the cherry achievement. I wasn't expecting there to be a stealth game in the collection at all, so this was a nice surprise. I'm giving Rail Heist an A-. The last puzzle game on the list maybe barely qualifies as one, but it does require some thinking, so I'll keep it here. Warp Tank is a bit of a cross between Metal Storm and VVVVVV, where you control a tank that can stick to any wall and warp between sightlines. Of course, you're a tank, so you can also fire cannon shots, but you have to be careful not to destroy certain platforms you might need to progress further in the level. There's a hub world with a few vehicular NPCs to talk to, and a bunch of levels to seek out that award you capsule points for clearing, and as you clear more levels, more areas of the hub world will open up. The game's got one of the catchiest tunes in the entire compilation, and though I'm not sure 70s spy jazz quite fits the vibe, I'll still bounce along to it anyway. The tank moves tile by tile, giving the game a bit more of an MS-DOS Apogee software vibe, which means every platform and angular wall is deliberately designed. The coffee mugs from Campanella return, which will spawn if you launch off of irregular-looking tiles. Which tiles those can be is a slight readability concern because some tiles will look off, but are just textured differently for the purposes of art direction, so I'm not sure if I will try to collect them all. Warp Tank will run you somewhere between 4 to 5 hours to 100%, and it's a solid game that I want to get right back into after I finish this review. I give it an A-. If you're interested in billions of bullets, you've got 4 shoot-'em-up selections in this collection. Now, while I like shmups, I can't say I'm a proficient player of them. Unless you've got some sort of dodge mechanic, I'm probably gonna stupidly slam into a bullet every 7 seconds. And that puts me behind the 8 ball for Caramel Caramel, a colorful shooter that's much tougher than it looks. You're a blimp ship that just got a camera and plan on taking a photographic tour of the galaxy across 3 different planets. And I'd love to see the other planets someday, but I am just not good enough to beat a single level in this game. Editor's note, fucking crushed it, got to level 3, and then died. But don't worry about that, now you have some extra footage. For starters, you start with 0 lives and just 2 hit points, and it takes a few minutes to score enough points to be awarded another. This is largely done by using your camera to take photographs of enemies, which freezes them in place and doubles their kill score. You can also take photographs of elements of the field, which will generate a bunch of marbly things for more points. There are also crystals to collect which recharge your camera, and a bonus spread shot you can fire by releasing the shoot button. All of the elements are cool, I just can't enjoy them because I can't get more than a couple of minutes into the first level. Despite that, I'll still rate this a B-. Now this one, on the other hand, I also can't beat, but I can get to level 3! Star Wasper has its own unique mechanics that work pretty well despite the insane difficulty. You have 3 different ships with their own firing styles, and a letter combo system that's kinda cool. Each enemy spits out either an E or a G, and spelling out words will either cause a special super blast, add to your firepower, or increase your score multiplier. It's the latter that really matters, because you can crank that soldier multiplier as high as you want, as long as you don't die or accidentally spell a non-word. And much like Caramel, lives are at a premium here, so you've got to score quickly and aggressively to rack up lives. Now, vertical shooters don't work as great in widescreen as horizontal shooters because there's just less real estate to react to enemies, but I think they do as well as they can to give you fair reaction timing with the way fleet patterns are designed. That being said, there's not quite as much personality here as Caramel, but it's still perfectly fine. I give this one a C+, but only because there's no letter grade between a C+ and a B-. And don't say C++. This was probably made in Unity. If you're a fan of Gunsmoke or Pocky and Rocky, then you'll probably have a great time with Alphazar's Hat, a top-down co-op shooter that's by far the friendliest of all the offerings. You play as a pair of animals who escape the captivity of an evil magician, and go on a quest to rescue their friends. Much like Star Wasper, there's a combination mechanic at play, though it's quite different here. Rather than spell out a word, you'll be combining 2 or 3 of the same symbol to unlock a power-up. 2 gives you the weaker power-up, and all 3 gives you the super power-up. So 3 hearts will give you an extra life bar, while 2 only refills a bar. You can get 1 shield, or 5 shields, or powered up shots. In addition to having actual continues, this game gives you a spin dash which allows you to dodge projectiles. So if you're looking for a shooter that's more inviting to a casual player, this is the one to try. Now, you'll get the bad ending if you use a continue, but with enough time and mastery, I think even I could pull that off. The environments are fun, the bosses are silly, this is all a vibe I can really groove with. Alphazar's Hat gets an A+. Seaside Drive is a super fun drive and drift shooter with the kinda 80s vaporware aesthetic that filled millennial social media feeds all over the internet in the 2010s. The strength of your shooting depends on your drift meter, which you can refill at any moment by skidding back and forth, which encourages a lot of movement and on-the-fly reactions. Each level gets progressively crazier, starting with basic vehicular combat, and then you're fighting random shapes, and then ghosts and flying skulls? If you manage to finish a stage without dying, you'll get an Arkanoid-style bonus stage which awards you 2 bonus lives, encouraging mastering those first 2 levels so you can stack lives and hunker down for the second half. This one's just flat out great, and again, what a vibe. Orcas blasting ocean waves at you as you fight off a rainbow of jellyfish, bouncy balls dropping out of the sky to kill you, bosses that come out of the background layer to join the fight. Seaside Drive deserves its own arcade cabinet with maybe a couple more levels and some extra blast processing. But as far as UFO 50 goes, I give it another A+. Some of the games in UFO 50 feel designed specifically for me, and Valbrace is one of those titles. It's a combination of first-person dungeon crawler and Nintendo's Punch-Out, as you make your way through perilous labyrinths and fight enemies with a combination of dodging, blocking, and exploiting openings. Folks, we've got a mini-map! And like the best dungeon crawlers, there's switches, there's locked doors, there's traps, there's hidden passages, and there's chests. To fight! You'll die a few times in this one for sure, but the game's continue function allows you to resume at the floor you died on, so it's not the worst penalty in the world, but it is an effective one. These are massive floors, and it could easily get disorienting if it weren't for the spells you find on certain walls. One of these incantations brings up a helpful larger map of the region you're in, and while it's not a complete map of the entire floor, it's at least useful in finding hallways you've missed or getting back to certain landmarks. There's a tiny bit of rogue here, not in the floor design, which is handcrafted, but in the experimentation. You'll find drinking fountains in the dungeons, and not all of them are helpful. You'll also find various colored potions, and the only real way to know how they work is to be your own guinea pig and chug those flasks. Weaponry can handle differently, and you'll just have to bring them into battle to see how. As for the leveling, you acquire essence from enemy encounters, and spend that essence at a throne to level up, which grants you 3 points to put into your strength, constitution, or wisdom. This is no Dark Souls, however. They keep it very simple, as they are literally represented by your life, stamina, and magic bars in the bottom left. Some weapons do, however, require that you pass a stat check to wield them, so it's up to you on how you think you should best develop your character. Personally, I think you should work on your stamina first, as it's definitely the quickest to deplete. You'll also find gems, which you can trade into a helpful old lady that offers some potions and weaponry, though I wouldn't rely on that too much, as gem drops aren't that common. Naturally, the deeper you descend, the more treacherous it gets, so you'll want to do plenty of inventory management, which does get full quite often. Maybe it's wiser to drop a consumable attack item so you can pick up another health potion. Thankfully, these items stay on the map and you can come back to pick them up later. The dungeon environments don't vary up too much in visual design, though considering the theoretical hardware limitations, I kinda get it. It's not a deal breaker, but again, remember that this is one game out of 50, like, it's amazing that there's a game this dense in this collection. Aside from some slight visual tedium, I'm a big fan of everything Valbrace does, and I give it an A. A common theme throughout UFO 50 is the developer's penchant for carrying mechanics and settings forward. The sport of golf transposes from Golfaria to pin golf, and then the aiming and firing carries forward to Lords of Disconia. And Porgy's combination of underwater exploration and slowly expanding trips gets carried over into our next game, Divers, which also has similar post-apocalyptic vibes to Avianos, but swap out the birds for aquatic creatures. These three beastmen take Johnson to the depths to find relics and improve their loadouts. But while Porgy is a Metroidvania that expands your sub's abilities, Divers is an RPG with turn-based battles and resource gathering. These resources are used in combination with a shop back at home to kit out your party with better and better weapons, as well as limited use items like bombs. As you progress further in the ocean, you'll find levers to unlock shortcuts, as well as bosses that restrict travel until you defeat them. The battles play out in a very simple Dragon Quest style, and I mean even simpler than Dragon Quest itself, which is kinda hard to do, you know? But your party members are limited to just what they can carry in their two hands, whether it's weaponry or healing items, so you have to plan ahead at the base for what you expect to do during your expedition. For a brief period, I gave 2 of the 3 characters a small potion bag so that they could each heal someone 4 times. But eventually you get the medium bag, which carries 8 charges on its own, so you can fit another character with a shield instead to improve their defense. The combat isn't completely brain dead, however, as there are elemental affinities to the weapons, and some are more effective than others with various enemies. But it never gets more intricate than the very first encounter. Its main purpose is to sort of gatekeep areas of the ocean until you're strong enough to explore them, and that's a fairly effective way of keeping you pointed in the right direction, because it's otherwise not always obvious where to go. You have a limited range of vision, and there's no map whatsoever, so you really have to feel your way around and memorize the layout. Luckily and thankfully, the developers went for a handcrafted world just like Porgy, rather than the randomized layouts of some of their other games. So if you're so inclined, you can draw a map yourself. Who am I kidding? You're just gonna find a guide. Look, taking notes is fun! I haven't finished this game yet, but I did progress past the halfway point and upgraded my character's weapons multiple times, so I feel pretty confident in giving this one a final grade. The halfway boss ended up being just as simple as the average encounter, just with the added wrinkle of healer henchmen that get rezzed on occasion. I honestly didn't have much trouble at all. The game wants to kinda keep me at arm's length with its hostile atmosphere, but that kinda draws me in all the same. If your party wipes, you lose everything you gained, including money and experience, which is a lot more punishing than Porgy simply returning the items you were transporting. So you really have to play carefully and defensively. That makes the frequent encounters a bit annoying, actually, because even in the earlier sections, you'll still get roped into a few, and I think the game could maybe have learned from the Mother series to eliminate low-level encounters after a while. The combat serves its purpose in breaking up the exploration and establishing stat check boundaries, so any additional battling just adds a bit of unnecessary tedium to the affair. Plus, it drains the charges on your weapons, which can cut an expedition much shorter than you were planning. I actually like the idea that your weapons have limited uses per run to make sure you keep returning to camp, but that only makes the trash encounters more of a nuisance. All that said, I like divers. It's unusual and unique in a way the more conventional RPG in this collection isn't. I just think some of the friction is good and some of it is pointless. I give this one a B-. While a pastiche of Final Fantasy is something you'd expect from a massive tribute to the 8-bit era, you probably wouldn't have expected it to be a full-length 20 to 30-hour one, but that's exactly what Grimstone is. Set in an apocalyptic version of Texas called Hell, hey, it's nonfiction, angels and devils battle it out while the few remaining humans live in scattered wild western towns. The game starts with an interesting way of forming your party. The Pleasant Town Saloon is ablaze, and the angel you control can only save 4 of the people inside, which then becomes your party. You're given just a sentence or so of description for each character, so you'll just have to make your picks based on vibes. For me, I picked the Doctor because, well, certainly they'd be a healer, and they are. I also picked Umbra, and the Dancer, and Maria the Outlaw. I can't speak to other party configurations, but this one took a little bit of time to find its footing. Anne and Doc were very weak offensively, and they all started with very basic class perks. But as time went on, they each started to show their strengths. But before I get into that, let's talk the basic gameplay loop, which is as old school as RPGs get. You'll typically get to a town, rest up there, then hover around that town in the overworld, grinding out battles until you feel safe enough to venture outward. This kind of gameplay won't appeal to everyone, especially in today's era of JRPGs that focus on quality of life amenities, but it should feel comfortable to fans of the original Final Fantasy or Dragon Warrior. These battles play out pretty conventionally, the only real wrinkles being that attacks use a timing meter similar to the Judgment Ring in Shadow Hearts, and enemy aggro is applied on a top-to-bottom basis, so you can keep your weaker party members on the bottom to avoid getting hit as much. Encounters can be as large as 10 monsters deep, and in the early going, you likely won't have any multi-target skills or attacks, so these battles can take a fairly long time to play out. Combined with the grind for experience, that's a significant time investment for one game when there are 49 others you could be playing. I personally don't mind this kind of gameplay, but if you're used to Persona or Sea of Stars, this is not like those games, and you'll probably be sorely missing some of the modernities of today's RPG game design. Getting back to the class perks though, Doc has a passive ability that allows healing items to be used twice. Combined with a perk that makes healing more effective, Doc can be a lifesaver if you bring him along. Anne has party-wide buffs that can raise evasion and attack, while Maria's rifle specialization allows her to do massive damage. Umbra is perhaps the most interesting, as she can learn new abilities by talking to animals located in various parts of the overworld and dungeons. Her heal is very low cost, and her life leech does pretty solid damage when you first get it. Gust is a showstopper though, doing medium damage to all enemies on the field. That ability made short work of a couple of bosses relying on additional henchmen. You can also gain additional skills by completing personal quests for your party members, though I don't have footage of that here. I'm kinda running low on hard drive space from recording all of these games. As for the story, there's not much of one. You're chasing after the legend Lily O'Mule, who supposedly died in that saloon fire but still seems to be leaving witnesses here and there across the state. There's also an angel who's been separated from their brother, and of course an ongoing holy war. But otherwise, you're mostly dealing with small vignettes from town to town, like the village of Heston, which has been overrun with demons, or the town of Oster, whose trains are being raided by bandits. These trains function as a form of fast travel to take you to and from the largest city hubs in the game, which is definitely useful and not too costly. There's also a bank where you can keep your money to accrue interest while you're out fighting battles. Much like the Dragon Quest series, if your party wipes, you wind up at the most recent town chapel you've been to, and lose a ton of your money in the process. Usually half of your money, but sometimes I've lost all of it, so the bank is essentially insurance against that. The early game economy is a bit stacked against you, as even simple healing items cost a decent amount of money, let alone the cost of some of the weapons and armor. But by the halfway point of the game, encounters start giving you a lot more money, and your bank account will likely be soaring as well, so it no longer becomes as big an issue. That does mean a lot of the difficulty of the game is front-loaded, which is a little weird, but when you build your game around grinding, you can't really complain as a developer if your players eventually way outgrow your encounter design. But yeah, I was experiencing far more wipes in the first few hours than the rest of the campaign. Even if the encounters took forever, I was still getting through them just fine. That does leave Grimstone in kind of an awkward place. While a lot of the games in this collection take from something old and take from something contemporary to make an iterative and unique collaboration, Grimstone mostly just feels like something old. Sure, the Wild West theme is novel, and it's fun to fight living tumbleweed, but everything else about the game is purely an old school experience, for better or worse. I enjoyed my time playing it, but it's hard to recommend, considering it clings really closely to that 80s RPG design. If you have the patience for long battles, possibly resetting for party experimentation, and a few frustrating TPKs, or you once played 8-bit RPGs as a kid, then Grimstone might fit you just fine. Otherwise, you might want to hold off on it until you've enjoyed some of the other games in UFO 50. I give Grimstone a C+. Alright, before we wrap up, I still have a little bit more I want to talk about. Look, you're already this deep, just keep the seatbelt on. So, the developers at Mossmouth called this game a collection of 50 full-sized games, and it might be worth asking how true that statement is.
First and foremost, these are not mini-games, but every single game is a complete experience from its opening title screen to its ending credits.
Sure, UFO 50 is $25, and that's a ridiculously low asking price already for such an absurdly huge collection, but I still think it's worth investigating. And after playing all 50 and beating over half of them, I'd say that the games in UFO 50 fall into 3 categories. There's the full-size games as advertised, and when I say full-sized, I mean in the context of the genre and era they represent. I certainly wouldn't expect a beat-em-up to be 10 hours long, for example. Then there's a category I'm calling shareware length, because there are some games that feel less like a full release and more like the first episode of a larger trilogy like the old Commander Keen series. And then there's games that don't quite feel like they've fully graduated out of the prototype stage. I'm calling this the Newgrounds category, not in a derogatory way, but because you might expect to see games like this on that site, just not with this tight retro sheen. So here are the 50 games sorted into those 3 categories with my beaten times or projected lengths, based on my own completion percentage or general internet discourse. And while it's definitely not an entire collection of full-length games, the amount of full-length games in this collection is absolutely massive for the amount you're spending. Even ignoring the 20-hour JRPG, there's Valbrace, which will take you a while to make it through each floor without dying, there's Rail Heist 25 levels, Black Koala has 50 levels, Warp Tank has several dozen levels. It's just crazy that there's so much on offer here. And even if we talk about the games I consider shareware length, that's still hours and hours of different games to enjoy across a wide variety of genres. So if anyone's seriously worried about the value proposition, I mean, come on, you've watched the video to this point, right? You know it's worth it. Let's also talk about the difficulty of these games, because there's been a lot of talk about how tough a lot of them are, which usually leads to someone defending them with the claim that they're NES Hard. I've been around for a while, my first console was the ColecoVision, so I'm well acquainted with the difficulty of NES games, and I can say that NES Hard is definitely a true descriptor. For some of the games. So again, I've got 3 categories here. Some games are accessible to any newcomer or fairly balanced, some games are brutal in that classic NES anti-rental way, and some go a little beyond in what I'd compare to that of a roguelite. Because remember, this comes from the people behind the Spelunky games, so it's fair to say that roguelite game design and challenge curves are an apt comparison. And when you look at this list, again, it's more balanced than you'd think. Sure, there are some very difficult games to finish in this collection, but there are plenty that are approachable to casual players or even complete newcomers. And what one finds difficult may be easy for another. I think Onion Delivery is the hardest game in the collection, but someone else might have cherried it without any issue. So if you're concerned about not having fun because you can't get far in certain games, then consider this list and try some of the less punishing entries to see if they're a good fit. I'd also like to talk about Omissions, which is almost absurd to think about with a collection this large, but there are definitely genres that aren't quite represented well enough in UFO 50 that if there's ever a sequel or DLC, maybe we could see a better focus on them. While racing and fighting games are sort of represented here, I think there could definitely be more, like a Super Scalar style racing game or a straight up traditional fighting game. While turn-based strategy is covered by Avianos and Lords of Disconia, I do think it's interesting that there's nothing akin to Fire Emblem or Famicom Wars in the selection. Also, this might sound weird because of how many platformers there are, but there's really no equivalent to the Mario series here at all. And maybe that's fine, but I do think it stands out as unusual. While it wasn't the biggest genre in its time, there probably could have been a visual or adventure novel like Metal Slater Glory or Famicom Detective Club. It also might have been interesting to see an isometric adventure like Head Over Heels or Solstice, and the lack of any type of falling block game is also kinda curious. I don't need to see straight up knockoffs, mind you, but these are some gaps that could be filled in the future if Mossmouth ever decides to return to this universe. Lastly, I think I should touch on the whole overarching narrative to the collection. I'm not going to go deep on the lore here because there are probably channels out there already doing a 5-hour analysis or whatever, but go ahead and skip to this time code if you want to find this stuff out for yourself. Alright, so there are two ways to discover the secret metagame within UFO 50. One is to go into the terminal and use the list command to see the executable names of the various games. If you keep going down the list, you'll eventually find a 51st game, Miasma, which is short for Miasma Tower. The longer way to reach this is to begin a scavenger hunt hidden inside a UFO 50 that starts at this one room in Mini and Max. The symbol on the screen here is the symbol that represents the terminal on the menu screen. This gives you your first clue, which indicates changing to the color of blue in camouflage, which then gives you another clue, and so on and so forth. Either way, you land at this odd basement in which you interact with various objects until you find a prototype disc for an early version of Paint Chase. Complete it to get yet another clue for the scavenger hunt, and this will continue until you get further access to other areas of Miasma Tower, which is essentially a secret project hidden inside a UFO 50 by disgruntled UFO Soft employee Gregory Milk, who has felt that the company has fallen far away from their original vision under their current owners and producers, the Nemuru family. The finances for the company are beyond flatlining, as the Nemurus waste money on pointless expenses like a ridiculously large corporate headquarters that is a chore to get around, ancient game hardware that has fallen into disrepair and goes unused, and a comic book franchise just to make Winston Nemuru happy. One of these seemingly pointless projects which Greg has been assigned to is the UFO 50 project itself, in which LX systems bundled with 50 games are sent to a time capsule company called MPI, who will preserve the computers until the year 2039. So Miasma Tower's inclusion is basically meant to be an artistic statement and final middle finger. While not everyone is doom and gloom at the company, several longtime employees are burnt out and some are even sleeping at the office. The company is seemingly still making games, but not for any particular audience other than their bosses. As the creative director says in her office, what's the point of making games no one can play? There's also the matter of Chiffon Bola, a former game designer for the company that's no longer there, in a kind of ominous way. Her file is missing from the employee records, her cubicle has been cleared out, and at one point she confronts Greg about this at the very end of Miasma Tower. Well, an image of her anyway. At this point you finally meet face to face with Tao, who is represented as a grasshopper with a fiddle, a nod to the classic Aesop myth, The Grasshopper and the Ants. You know, that myth about the grasshopper who doesn't collect any things or save things up for the winter, and then when the winter comes, he's begging for the ants to let him in, but the ants are like, haha, you didn't save up, screw you. Now, there's more to the story, but it depends on how cynical or fantastical you decide to read it. The cynical path is that Tao is a typical producer that doesn't understand how the sausage is made or why something that is fun has to be hard work to make. And the reason why they are sending these games and computers off to a time capsule company is because Tao knows the company is about to go bankrupt and wants to leave some sort of legacy behind for the future. Though, if we're talking Aesop, that would probably be more the position of the ants, not the grasshopper. And as for Chiffon Bola, she probably was fired or quit after her confrontation, and Greg feels guilty because he didn't join her in that meeting. That's the cynical reading, and it's probably the most likely. Of course, there's a more bizarre, more creepy pasta-esque reading if you so prefer, because Tao gave all his employees a philosophy book which you find everywhere on the campus. There's a room with a shame circle where Seaside Drive director Shane North's life has been dissected on one of the whiteboards, and there's a worried friend and a detective calling on the phone at the front desk. You can find a stain on the wall by the bike rack where Chiffon would keep her bike, and her bike itself is dismantled and hidden in a crawl space. This all suggests that some foul play may have happened, and that Tao's talk about a dark winter and insistence on time capsules could be a lot more literal in their intention. I'm not saying it's likely, but it's possible that Tao is running a doomsday cult here, and he expects some sort of nuclear war to break out, which, I mean, in the 80s we were still coming out of the Cold War, so it's not that crazy to postulate. In the executive suite, there's a newspaper article about a plane crash on the wall with the phrase Semper Renasci written underneath on a plaque. This roughly translates from Latin to mean always be reborn. Maybe by the time this video comes out there will be more analysis here, but when I look around about this in specific, there's just not enough discussion. So at least for now, that's where the trail stops. After talking with the boss, Greg heads up to the roof and takes a joyride on Winston's private helicopter. Again, the needless expenses here. And the game ends. All that remains is a puzzle that leads to a room where the time capsules are being kept. But again, the trail stops there. For now, anyway. Could there be more here? Possibly. Will further analysis make this section and myself look incredibly foolish? Definitely. But it's certainly interesting to speculate on the fate of UFO Soft and its employees. Hey, I love preservation more than anyone, but what exactly was Tao's goal here? Did he think nuclear winter was imminent, or did he just see no path forward for the company to remain solvent and wanted to preserve something? The developers were still working on games called Jet Skater and Hollow Vice, but were these just to be put in time capsules as well? And for whom do these capsules open? Hopefully a smarter and funnier YouTuber than me can put the pieces together, or maybe there's still more to unearth. Either way, like a lot of things in this cold gray world, it's beyond my capability and reason. That brings us to the final score, and there's only one category really in question here, because obviously in terms of variety, art direction, sound design, and UI, they mostly crush it. But how about the gameplay score? Well, if you've been paying attention, I've given letter grades to all the games, and I assigned point values to those grades as well. So having added them all up, it comes out to an average of 8.13 out of 10. For 50 games? For 50 games to average an 8 out of 10. That's insane. And on top of all the secret stuff, the cheat codes, the minigames, the metagame, for this to cost $25, that's better than any Game Pass subscription, any streaming service. It's unbelievable. So I'm giving the gameplay a 9, which combined with the other categories results in a 92, the highest score I've given a game since Psychonauts 2. That's a 3-year time period in which I've played through over 500 games, and it placed in 2nd out of 500. I'm talking better than Animal Well, better than Cocoon, better than Crystal Project, better than Tears of the Kingdom, and I love those, well, most of those games. Sorry, Zelda, really bad Ganon in that one. But even if there are games you don't like in this collection, there are so many others you could love, and the majority of them are so thoughtfully designed, so timeless, so mimetic and copacetic with each other, always carrying forward game mechanics. Wait, Semper Renasci, always be reborn. Planet Zoldath is reborn as Campanella, which is reborn as Pilot Quest. Golfaria becomes Waldorf's Journey. Waldorf's Journey becomes Jet Skater. I am losing my mind and grasping at straws. Look, let's close with this. Are you a fan of retro games and indie games? Then you need to own this game and experience its many highs and lows yourself. Do the days of game overs and no saves make you cringe? Maybe watch others play the games first and see if you'll vibe with them. But even if you only beat a tiny fraction of the games in this collection, I'm telling you, the $25 is worth it. Even if you hate Barbuta, just keep pushing forward. I guarantee you there's something you'll like in here. We may never get a game quite like UFO 50 again, so definitely get in on it if you can afford it. Because if the gaming industry and its many layoffs are any indicator, we may be headed for a pretty long winter. Thanks to everyone who made it this far into the video. I know listening to my crackling, gargling voice can be an endurance test, but it really means a lot that you watched all the way through, even if you disagree with everything I said. If you've played UFO 50, what's your favorite game? It's probably Magic Garden, isn't it? That's fine, I'm the wrong one here, don't worry. Special thanks to my supporters on Patreon who are keeping me afloat long enough to work on major projects like this. If you want to get in the credits, you can donate a few bucks to the Patreon and also see videos early, as well as vote on a game for me to do a video of. In fact, next week's video is a Patreon poll winner, Mystical Ninja starring Goemon. And the week after is another deep dive into Steam Next Fest demos. On most Thursdays, I also do quick looks of new indie games, and those are always fun. So there's just a lot going on here, and you'll definitely want to click that subscribe button and hit the bell for notifications. Is that still a thing? I'll be doing at least 1 to 2 videos a week for the rest of the year, and then beyond that will really depend on financial support. So, if you enjoyed this, I appreciate anything. A like, a follow, a donation, a shout out on social media, whatever you can provide. You're the engine that makes this whole thing run. I hope you have a great day, and until next time, you'll find me in another castle.